Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky was one of the most brilliant military minds of the USSR, who was considered the Red Napoleon. He was feared by his enemies, respected by his comrades in arms, and feared by the highest party ranks. However, in 1937, he was arrested and shot as an enemy of the people. Was he really a conspirator, or was he removed on Stalin's orders? Mikhail Tukhachevsky was born into a noble family, but his fate was not like that of aristocrats. In 1914, when the First World War broke out, he went to the front. The young officer showed himself brave and determined, but soon fell into German captivity. For many, this meant the end of a military career, but not for Tukhachevsky. He tried to escape 5 times in 1 year. He was caught, thrown into a punishment cell, but he again looked for a way to freedom. He escaped only on the 6th attempt. He returned to Russia, but the country was already different. There was a revolution. Tukhachevsky quickly realized that the old order had collapsed and went over to the side of the Bolsheviks. After the Civil War, Tukhachevsky became famous as one of the most talented commanders of the Red Army. He developed the tactic of deep offensive, which later formed the basis of Soviet military doctrine. It was his ideas that helped the USSR create a powerful army. In 1920, he played a key role in suppressing the Kronstadt uprising, when sailors and soldiers demanded free elections and the abolition of Prodrazverstka. The fighting was brutal. It took 2 weeks to quell the uprising, and thousands of people died. This made Tukhachevsky, in the eyes of the Soviet leadership, a staunch defender of the revolution. Later, he developed a plan to defeat the White armies in Siberia and participated in the war against Poland. Although the Polish campaign of 1920 was a failure, it was there that he first proposed the use of massive tank attacks and aviation. He believed that an army should be fast, mobile, and well-armed. It was he who proposed the vigorous development of tank forces, amphibious operations, and air defense systems. Had his reforms been fully implemented, perhaps the USSR would have been even better prepared for the Great Patriotic War. But this brilliant commander had one serious flaw. He was not able to hide his thoughts. Tukhachevsky often criticized the leadership, argued with Stalin, and openly promoted his ideas, even if they went against the party line. This made him a dangerous figure in the eyes of the authorities. He was too smart, too popular, and too independent. In the 1930s, when mass repression began in the USSR, such people were especially vulnerable. But was he really an innocent victim? Or was he plotting against Stalin? The answer may be hidden only in the documents, which are still classified. In early 1937, Marshal Tukhachevsky was at the peak of his career. He was developing plans to modernize the army, personally met with Stalin, and did not realize that he was already under the hood of the security services. But the conspiracy against him was already in full swing. Stalin was always suspicious of the military. The Red Army was growing stronger. The generals were gaining popularity, and for the Soviet leader it meant one thing: a potential threat to his power. At this point, something strange happened. In the hands of Stalin falls into the hands of Stalin dossier on Tukhachevsky. From Germany, the document allegedly confirmed that the Marshal was conducting secret negotiations with enemies of the USSR and preparing a coup. Later, it turned out that it could be a fake compromise planted by Hitler to weaken the Soviet army before the future war. But Stalin believed in this unmasking material, or simply decided to use it. After the appearance of the dossier, Tukhachevsky was under the full control of the NKVD. His movements were monitored, intercepted letters, tapped telephone conversations. But Marshal did not notice anything. Moreover, a month before his arrest, he met with Stalin and was sure that everything was in order. What they talked about, it is not known. But there is a version that Stalin was checking his reaction, observing his behavior, looking for signs of betrayal. After this meeting, Tukhachevsky continued to work, gave instructions to subordinates, planned reforms. He did not realize until the last moment that he was doomed. Why did Tukhachevsky decide to destroy? There are several versions. 1. Stalin was afraid of a military coup. The army was becoming too influential, and Tukhachevsky too popular. Perhaps the leader simply decided to get rid of a potential rival. Version 2. The Nazi provocation worked. If the dossier was indeed forged by German intelligence, it means that Hitler was able to weaken the USSR before the war even began. And the third, someone in Stalin's entourage deliberately framed Marshal. Perhaps he was framed by other military commanders to remove a rival and take his place. And which of these options was real? We will never know. Tukhachevsky's arrest signaled mass repression in the army. He was followed by dozens of other high-ranking military officers. In the late 30s, about 40,000 commanders of various levels were eliminated, which seriously weakened the Red Army before the war. On May 22, 1937, Tukhachevsky was on a business trip to Kiev. He did not suspect that he had been under surveillance for a long time. Suddenly, the Marshal is summoned to Moscow, ostensibly for a report. When he arrived, he was immediately arrested. No explanation was given. The investigators had no warrant for arrest. It appeared only after 10 days. Tukhachevsky was simply taken away, as if he was already a criminal. From that moment, his fate was sealed. The investigators knew there was no evidence of guilt, but no one cared. It was necessary to get a confession from the Marshal in the conspiracy, even if he did nothing. Tukhachevsky was kept in a cell in complete isolation, not allowed to sleep, interrogated for hours. But he kept silent. Then they began to use physical influence. According to some evidence, the Marshal was beaten until he lost consciousness, and then brought back to his senses and continued interrogation. His ribs were broken, and his face was so mutilated that the guards did not immediately recognize him when they brought him to the court. But worst of all, he was forced to sign a confession. Exhausted, weary, he broke down and confessed to something he had not done. On June 11, 1937, the trial took place, if it can even be called that. The trial lasted less than 3 hours. During that time, 8 top Red Army commanders, including Tukhachevsky, were found guilty of espionage and conspiracy. There were no defense witnesses, no lawyers either. All confessions were beaten out by torture, but no one cared. The verdict was pre-written. After the verdict, the Marshal was immediately taken away. He had no chance of escape, but was he really shot? Or was it even worse? The answer is hidden in the classified archives. After Marshal Tukhachevsky was convicted, his sentence was executed the same day. This was standard practice in Stalin's times, to shoot enemies of the people quickly and without unnecessary ceremonies, so that no one had time to interfere. However, the version of his execution has many controversial points. According to the official version, Tukhachevsky was shot on June 11, 1937. But there were rumors that in fact he could have been killed much earlier, and all this was done to hide the traces of cruel torture which he experienced in the detention center. And the act of execution was already staged. The document was signed later, and the date of execution was substituted. The intrigue surrounding Tukhachevsky's execution is intensified if we look at the documents that were found later in the archives. When historians began to study these materials, they found inconsistencies in the locations and dates of his execution. For example, one of the documents states that the Marshal was shot in Moscow, while another says that it happened in one of the camps near Moscow. And according to the third version, in general, on the day of his execution, other military activities were carried out in the capital. which makes it impossible to execute the sentence at the specified time. These strange inconsistencies in the documents and the version that the Marshal could have been killed in advance lead to a darker version of events. Perhaps Tukhachevsky was shot not because he was an enemy of the people, but because he was a convenient scapegoat needed to cover up deeper political games. In the 1990s, when access to archives became freer, historians found documents that prove that there was no conspiracy. All the charges against Tukhachevsky turned out to be made up. In fact, the investigation pressured him to confess, and the confessions of other defendants in the case were also beaten out by torture. There was no evidence that the Marshal was associated with the Nazis. All this version was a construct of the authorities, aimed at getting rid of people dangerous to Stalin. Not only Tukhachevsky was accused of conspiracy, but also 7 other top commanders of the Red Army, who were also shot. In addition, their names disappeared from history. Not only they were destroyed, but also their works, achievements. They were even crossed out of the history books. When Marshal Tukhachevsky was shot, his name disappeared from the official history of the Soviet Union. He became a symbol of the enemy of the people, and his activities were declared anti-state. Even his merits during the Civil War and the first successes of the Red Army were crossed out of the textbooks. But everything changed 20 years later, when it was time to revise many of the repressions of the Stalin era. In 1957, after Stalin's death, the authorities finally recognized that the charges against Tukhachevsky were false. He was rehabilitated, and already in the 1960s his name was returned to the textbooks. It was a symbolic gesture that showed that the country was finally ready to recognize the mistakes of the past and not to forget the heroes. However, a few decades later, in the 2000s, new sensational investigations cast doubt on all previous conclusions. In some sources appears information that the German trace in the case of Tukhachevsky could indeed be genuine. This investigation refers to documents that show that the Marshal may have held secret negotiations with Nazi Germany even before the Second World War. This fact sparks a new round of discussion. Perhaps Tukhachevsky was indeed involved in a conspiracy, but not the one that Stalin's investigators were talking about. Maybe the truth about his betrayal was quite different. Or is this another attempt to rewrite history? And yet the story of Marshal Tukhachevsky is still controversial. Was he a victim of Stalin's paranoia, or did he really participate in the conspiracy? The final answer to this question remains one of the main mysteries of the USSR.